Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. A simple nursery rhyme, innocent, playful, a staple of childhood recitation for centuries. But what if I told you that those 16 words contain a coded historical horror so disturbing that it had to be disguised as children's verse? That behind the seemingly innocent rhyme lies evidence of ritual sacrifice, class warfare, and a desperate attempt to process unspeakable communal trauma? The sanitization was so complete that modern parents recite these words without the slightest awareness of the blood-soaked history they're transmitting to their children. But the darkness persists, hiding in plain sight. When we examine the earliest documented versions of Jack and Jill, we uncover something far more sinister than a tumble down a hillside. We find ourselves staring into an abyss of medieval terror that speaks to humanity's darkest impulses, and the desperate need to transform those horrors into something palatable enough to survive through generations. Picture rural England, late 14th century, a time of famine, plague, and superstition. The Black Death had decimated the population, wiping out entire villages and leaving survivors desperate for explanation and protection. The church's hold over daily life was absolute, but beneath the Christian veneer, older pagan practices still thrived in the shadows, especially in remote communities where desperation fostered extreme measures. It's in this context that we must understand the true origins of Jack and Jill. The earliest manuscript containing a recognizable version of the rhyme was discovered in the restricted archives of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, dating to approximately 1375. The parchment bears the marks of attempted destruction, partial burning, and deliberate ink smudging. But what remains is enough to send a chill down your spine. The manuscript, written in Middle English with Latin marginalia, doesn't present Jack and Jill as a playful children's verse. Instead, it appears within an account of ritual practices deemed heretical by the church, practices meant to end a devastating drought that had brought a rural community to the brink of starvation. Dr. Eleanor Remington of the University of Edinburgh, who spent 3 years analyzing this manuscript, notes that the account describes 2 young villagers, Jacob, later anglicized to Jack, and Jillian, shortened to Jill, who weren't simply fictional characters, but actual historical figures. According to parish records cross-referenced with the manuscript, they were siblings from the village of Kilmersdon in Somerset, a location that would later proudly claim itself as the birthplace of the nursery rhyme, though for entirely different reasons than locals might imagine. Jacob and Jillian weren't chosen randomly. The manuscript describes them as those marked by God, a euphemism scholars recognize as referring to individuals with distinctive physical characteristics. In this case, both siblings had striking red hair, a trait often associated with witchcraft and devilry in medieval superstition. But the horror doesn't stop with their selection. The hill referenced in the rhyme wasn't a geographic feature, but rather the village's ancient sacrificial mound, a pre-Christian site, later topped with a well that served as the community's primary water source during the catastrophic drought of 1373 to 1375. Water, life, survival. The drought had lasted nearly 2 years. Crops had failed repeatedly. Children were dying of hunger. Livestock lay rotting in the fields, and the well on the ancient mound was running dry. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and in medieval Europe, when Christianity's promises failed to deliver salvation, communities often reverted to older, darker practices. The pail of water wasn't meant to be retrieved from the well. It was meant to be created through sacrifice. Imagine the scene: a community gathered at dusk, torches illuminating gaunt faces. 2 years of starvation had hollowed their cheeks and dimmed their eyes. The local priest, having failed to bring rain through prayer, stands silent as village elders lead the proceedings. Jacob and Jillian, barely into their teens, are adorned with dried flowers and herbs, a grotesque attempt to sanctify what is about to occur. The crown that Jack breaks isn't a royal symbol or even a reference to his skull, as some sanitized modern interpretations suggest. The Middle English term crown in the original text specifically refers to a ritual circlet made of woven branches from a sacred oak. This circlet was believed to connect the wearer to ancient gods who controlled the rains. When the manuscript describes Jacob falling and breaking this crown, it isn't describing an accident. The falling was ritualistic, the breaking was intentional, and what followed was far more horrific than a simple tumble down a hill. The original Middle English text contains a line omitted from all modern versions. The blade glistened in the cup as the child's life dimmed. The blood glistened in the cup as the child's life dimmed. The pail of water was a euphemism for the collection of blood sacrifice, a practice found across numerous pre-Christian European cultures during times of agricultural crisis. The siblings weren't sent to fetch water. They were sent to become water, to transform their life essence into the rain the community so desperately needed. But the true horror of this story isn't just in the act itself. It's in what happened afterward and how a community processes unspeakable collective guilt. Court records from 1377 detail the trial of 7 villagers from Kilmersdon, charged with heresy and murder. The documents describe how, following the sacrifice, rain indeed came, a torrential downpour that ended the drought but triggered landslides that killed 3 more villagers. This coincidence was enough to convince the superstitious community that their actions had been divinely validated, even as the church condemned them. The psychological impact of such communal trauma cannot be overstated. When communities participate in acts that violate their moral code, even when driven by survival, they must find ways to process that guilt. Often, this happens through the transformation of the horrific into something symbolic, palatable, even instructive. Dr. Remington's analysis suggests that the nursery rhyme emerged as a form of cultural memory processing, a way to acknowledge what happened while disguising its true horror. By transforming Jacob and Jillian into the simplified Jack and Jill, by recasting ritual murder as a simple accident, the community could continue to commemorate the sacrifice they believed saved them, while disguising its true nature from authorities and from themselves. The psychological concept of splitting, separating uncomfortable realities into more acceptable narratives, explains how the rhyme evolved. Each generation softened the tale further, until eventually the connection to its origins was completely severed in conscious memory. But the structure and symbolism remained intact, carrying the encoded trauma forward. Consider the power of the final line, "And Jill came tumbling after." In the sanitized version, it's simply a description of a girl falling down a hill. But in the original context, it describes something far more chilling. After Jacob's sacrifice, Gillian wasn't meant to be killed, at least not initially. The manuscripts suggest she was intended to carry the ritual crown back to the village as proof of the ceremony's completion. But whether from grief at watching her brother die, or from the terror of knowing she might be next if the rains didn't come, Jillian ran. The tumbling after describes her pursuit and capture by the villagers, her desperate attempt to escape, and her ultimate fate at the same sacrificial site. The oldest version of the manuscript contains details too graphic to repeat here, but the marginalia written by what appears to be a local priest expresses horror at the heathen regression of his flock and their belief that twinned blood calls stronger to the old gods. This concept of twinned blood, the sacrifice of siblings, appears repeatedly in European folklore surrounding drought and agricultural crisis. The symbolic potency of sibling sacrifice emerges across cultures precisely because it represents the breaking of our most fundamental taboo, the protection of family bonds and the innocence of children. When communities felt desperate enough to violate these principles, the psychological damage required extensive cultural processing, and process it they did. By the late 16th century, the rhyme had spread across England, each region adapting it slightly. In some versions, Jack and Jill become lovers rather than siblings, a significant change that further distances the rhyme from its origins while maintaining the essential dynamic of paired sacrifice. The symbolic elements transformed, but persisted. The hill became literal rather than ritual. The water became actual water rather than blood. The broken crown became a head injury rather than a sacrificial circlet. Each change moved the rhyme further from its origins while preserving its basic structure, a psychological safety mechanism that allowed the story to be told without confronting its horror. By the 18th century, when the first printed versions appeared in chapbooks, Jack and Jill had fully transformed into a simple cautionary tale about the dangers of carelessness. The Mother Goose collection of 1765 presents it without context or explanation, just another playful verse for children. But the darkness persists in unexpected details. Why do Jack and Jill need to ascend a hill for water, when wells are typically dug in low places where water naturally collects? Why does the rhyme end with their injuries rather than resolution? These inconsistencies hint at the forced transformation of a much different narrative. Folklorists have long recognized that nursery rhymes often contain coded references to historical events and practices too disturbing to be transmitted directly. Ring Around the Rosie encodes plague symptoms. Three Blind Mice references the execution of Protestant martyrs. These transformations allow societies to process trauma while seemingly protecting innocence. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. The transformation of atrocity into innocence isn't merely a passive psychological process. It can also be a deliberate act of historical erasure. Church records from 1425 reveal a systematic effort to replace pagan rituals with Christianized alternatives. A letter from Bishop Thomas Spofford to parish priests throughout Herefordshire explicitly instructs them to transform the heathen rhymes of the common folk into lessons of Christian virtue, that the memory of old ways might be extinguished while preserving those patterns to which the people have become accustomed. This deliberate sanitization campaign reveals that the transformation of Jack and Jill from ritual sacrifice victims to clumsy children wasn't merely organic evolution. It was intentional cultural reengineering. The church recognized that completely eliminating popular rhymes and stories was impossible, but transforming their meaning could serve the dual purpose of erasing pagan practices while maintaining cultural continuity. The psychological sophistication of this approach is remarkable. By preserving the rhyme's pattern while altering its content, cultural authorities created a mnemonic vessel that could continue to carry cultural memory without the dangerous freight of its original meaning. But even more disturbing than this deliberate sanitization is what it reveals about how easily we accept the cultural narratives we inherit. Each time a parent recites Jack and Jill to a child, they perpetuate a chain of transmission stretching back to actual ritual murder, all while believing they're sharing something innocent and playful. This disconnection between what we believe we're transmitting culturally and what we're actually passing down should give us pause. What other horrors lurk beneath the surface of our seemingly innocent cultural artifacts? What other atrocities have been transformed into entertainment? Modern audiences have no idea that when they recite Jack and Jill went up the hill, they're performing the linguistic descendant of a ritual commemoration of child sacrifice. The sanitization was so complete that the original meaning seems impossible, absurd even, when placed alongside the nursery rhyme we know today. Yet the evidence persists. Beyond the Cambridge manuscript, archaeological excavations near Kilmersdon in 1977 uncovered a medieval well situated atop a much older burial mound. Among the artifacts recovered were two small skeleton fragments, determined to belong to adolescents, along with the remains of a wooden circlet embedded with oak fragments, carbon dated to approximately 1375. These physical remnants align disturbingly well with the manuscript account, suggesting that far from being mere folklore, the story of Jacob and Gillian may be one of the most well-documented cases of medieval ritual sacrifice in English history, hiding in plain sight for centuries, disguised as a children's rhyme. The transformation didn't end with the nursery rhyme either. By the 19th century, Jack and Jill had inspired countless adaptations, including expanded versions with additional verses describing Jack's recovery through vinegar and brown paper, a nonsensical medical treatment that further distances the rhyme from its grim origins. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this cultural transmission is how it reveals our collective capacity for forgetting. The villagers who participated in the original ritual would have been haunted by their actions. The transformation of their deed into rhyme was a psychological necessity. But for us, centuries removed from the event, the forgetting is complete. We recite without remembering, transmit without knowing what we carry. Contemporary audiences would have recognized instantly what the rhyme referred to. The drought of 1373 to 1375 affected much of England, and news of the Kilmersdon incident and subsequent trials spread widely. When people first recited early versions of Jack and Jill, they did so with full awareness of its reference, perhaps nervously, perhaps as a way to process collective shock and horror at what desperate people had done. But with each generation, that context faded. The rhyme became divorced from its origins. By the time it was standardized in the 18th century, few, if any, reciters knew what it truly commemorated. This pattern of cultural forgetting isn't unique to Jack and Jill. It's a process repeated throughout human history. The transformation of specific horrors into generalized cultural artifacts, stripped of context and reimagined as entertainment or instruction. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The next time you hear a child reciting Jack and Jill Went Up the Hill, you'll know what those words once signified. You'll recognize that the simplistic sing-song rhythm once served to commemorate an act of desperate human sacrifice. You'll understand that the seemingly innocent nursery rhyme contains within it the encoded memory of real children who died terribly. This isn't to suggest we should stop reciting nursery rhymes or that we should burden children with the horrific origins of their cultural inheritance. Rather, it's to recognize how complex and layered our relationship with the past truly is, how we simultaneously remember and forget, commemorate and disguise, transmit and transform. The story of Jack and Jill reveals a fundamental truth about human culture. Our stories carry more than their surface meanings. They are vessels for historical memory, psychological processing, and collective identity, even when we've forgotten what they originally contained. In the gap between what a nursery rhyme appears to be and what it once signified lies a profound insight into how societies process trauma and transform atrocity into innocence. The disturbing origins of Jack and Jill aren't merely a historical curiosity. They're a window into the complex mechanisms by which we selectively remember and strategically forget. The historical Jacob and Gillian of Kilmersdon, if they could somehow know that their deaths would be transformed into a playful verse recited by children for centuries, might find cold comfort in their immortality. Their names simplified, their fates sanitized, but some echo of their story preserved in the cultural consciousness. Their tragedy, transmuted into nonsense verse, achieved what few historical events manage: permanence in cultural memory, albeit in disguised form. The pail of water they were sent to fetch, a euphemism for the sacrifice they were selected to become, has been carried down through the centuries after all, not as blood but as words. The true origins of Jack and Jill force us to confront uncomfortable questions about cultural transmission and the stories we tell ourselves about our past. How many other nursery rhymes, folk tales, and cultural artifacts carry similarly disguised horrors? How much of our cultural heritage consists of transformed trauma, sanitized for consumption? More importantly, what does it tell us about ourselves that we require this transformation? That we need to disguise historical horrors as children's entertainment? Is this disguise a form of denial, a way of distancing ourselves from the darkest aspects of human nature? Or is it a sophisticated psychological mechanism that allows us to both remember and forget simultaneously, to carry forward the essential lessons of history without being crushed by its weight? The story of Jack and Jill suggests it may be both. The transformation of ritual sacrifice into a cautionary tale about falling down hills allows the essential pattern to survive, a warning about the consequences of certain actions, while stripping away the specific horror that might otherwise make the story too terrible to transmit. When we understand nursery rhymes this way, as encoded cultural memories rather than mere nonsense, they take on new significance. They become artifacts of our collective psychological processing, revealing how societies transform experiences too terrible to face directly into narratives they can bear to repeat. This is the truly disturbing origin of Jack and Jill. Not just the historical horror that inspired the rhyme, but the recognition of how effectively we disguise such horrors from ourselves, generation after generation, until the disguise becomes the reality and the original meaning is lost entirely. And yet, traces remain for those who know how to look. Inconsistencies in the narrative, unusual word choices, symbolic patterns that make little sense in their sanitized form but align perfectly with their original context. The broken crown, the hill for water, the paired fall. These elements preserved the essential structure, while the meaning transformed. The manuscript in Cambridge, the archaeological findings in Kilmersdon, the church records of attempted erasure, these fragments allow us to reconstruct what was deliberately taken apart. They let us see the darker truth beneath the playful surface. This is what will stick with you. The next time you hear a child reciting Jack and Jill, you'll recognize it as both a nursery rhyme and a disguised commemoration of sacrifice. You'll hear both the innocent surface and the dark subtext simultaneously. You'll understand that what seems most innocent in our culture may carry the heaviest freight of historical horror, transformed but never truly erased. The disturbing truth about Jack and Jill isn't just that it originated in ritual murder. It's that we've been repeating the story for centuries without knowing what we're really saying. It's that cultural transmission works precisely because we forget, because the disguise becomes more real to us than what it conceals. And that realization forces us to question everything we inherit culturally, to wonder what other horrors have been transformed into entertainment, what other atrocities have been disguised as amusements. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water, but the water they sought wasn't meant to be carried down, and their fall wasn't an accident but a sacrifice, a desperate community's terrible choice in the face of extinction. That's the true origin of Jack and Jill. Not a tumble down a hillside, but a community's darkest moment transformed through centuries of retelling into something we can bear to repeat to children. The horror hidden, but never truly gone, carrying forward in disguised form the memory of what happened on that hill in Somerset over 600 years ago. The nursery rhyme you thought you knew is a lie. The history it hides is real. And now that you know, you can't unknow. You'll hear both versions simultaneously, the innocent and the terrible, each time those familiar words are spoken. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after.